Yeah, good way to get a good free trip home. Agreed to talk at these things. But yeah, as Sorka mentioned, I'm actually from here. I'm also from a Huntington's disease family. My dad has Huntington's, my mum's and sister are in the audience. But I also have had the great opportunity of getting involved in Huntington's disease research as a researcher. And I'm based in London and work with Ed Wild. Who knows who Ed Wild is? Anyway, good. Anyway, yeah. Don't worry, there'll be a video from Ed in a little moment. But yeah, he's certainly fun to work with as well. Always interesting. Really exciting that we're having an All-Ireland event as well. I think with Huntington's disease, a united front is always the best way, and whatever way we can share our services and help each other out is great. I got to talk yesterday at the event that they arranged for professionals, and it was great to see so many people that are, carers and nurses and social workers that actually want to learn about Huntington's disease. As you know yourselves, it can often feel that people don't understand it and don't know about it. So it was wonderful that people actually do want to help out and do want to, make a difference. I don't need to tell you guys what Huntington's disease is, but there's historically been fixations on the kind of chorea aspect. This is a very extreme case of chorea, one of our patients in London. But we know it's no longer called Huntington's chorea, it's Huntington's disease, because there's so much more to it. It's not just movements, it's the behavioural and the cognitive side, which you've heard so much from Niall and David earlier today. But it was first described by George Huntington back in 1872, although I think also will argue it might have been a Swedish doctor, she'll say later, before him. But he described it very well. This was just from observing a few generations of families in Long Island and New York. And he described the voluntary movements, but also the psychiatric components of it as well. And since then we've kind of learnt a lot, more than just looking at it and characterising it clinically. And things have happened between now and then that have really led to more advances. And one of those things is the discovery of the structure of DNA by Watson and Crick back in about 65 years ago. For a genetic illness, this is, finding the material that makes our DNAs is obviously hugely important, was a major advance for all of genetics, but obviously for a genetic family disease like Huntington's disease. You have things like the family associations coming into play back in the mid-80s. And 25 years ago, probably the biggest thing that happened in Huntington's disease until very recently is the discovery of the gene itself. And this was a huge collaborative effort worldwide. 58 scientists and over 12,000 family members give their body fluids, blood samples, sperm samples, all to make this discovery and find this gene, which is if you look back on that paper, it just says the Huntington's Disease Collaborative Research Group. This is quite a rare thing in research. Everyone wants to get their names and be credited, but there was agreement from the outset with these researchers that they would collaborate and find the gene together, which is kind of a legacy in the HD research field. And as a family member going into that, it was a real pleasure to find that ethos. And so we know that every case of Huntington's disease is caused by the same mutation. And this is this Huntington protein, the mutant Huntington protein. This is public enemy number 1. And this is, the real cause of everything goes wrong. We know it's caused by this CAG repeat length. So everybody has a repeat of these 3 letters in our genetic code in our Huntington gene. But in Huntington's disease, we get 36 or more and you get the disease, and it causes creates this mutant version of the protein that does this extra bad stuff. It gets sticky and clumps together and basically wreaks havoc on our brain cells and causes the cell death, which eventually leads to the symptoms. But why is this a good thing? To quote Ed Wild, he often says that Huntington's disease is the most curable, incurable brain disease. And this is because we actually know the cause. Most other diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and all these other more well-known neurological and neurodegenerative diseases most of those cases
come out of the blue and they don't know what causes them. But because we know what causes them, it gives us a real head start to try and find treatments. And the examples of this are a year after the discovery, scientists were able to create a mouse model that mimicked the disease. So the mice would grow up to have symptoms similar to Huntington's disease. A few years later, very clever scientists were able to genetically engineer these mice that have a genetic switch. So when the switch is on, they would develop Huntington's disease, but they could change things in their food that would cause the switch to be turned off, and that would allow the mice to get better. So this is one of the earliest pieces of evidence years ago that suggests that Huntington's was a problem that could be fixed, or something that could be changed to change the progression of the disease. And it also is, all the research over the last 25 years is, we know a lot more what Huntington does. It's involved in so many different pathways, and it's very important in our neurons and our brain cells. But this also means lots of different avenues for potential therapeutic targets, and all of these are currently in development for different stages in the therapeutic pipeline. But unfortunately, there's been over 100 clinical trials in Huntington's disease, and only 2 drugs so far have been marketed for Huntington's symptoms specifically, and that's tetrabenazine, which I think David mentioned before. It's one of those drugs that are often used for that chorea, that movement disorder. But there's more trials ongoing at the moment than there ever has been. So there's 13 drug trials ongoing as we speak, and 6 other invasive non-drug therapies like deep brain stimulation, and also kind of therapies that you wouldn't think could be in a clinical trial, like exercise or brain training. All of these are ongoing, and if you're interested in getting a summary, the Journal of Huntington's Disease has started doing a few times a year a summary of the current trials that are happening. So you can find that on there. It's open access, available to anyone if anybody wants that resource. So everybody wants to hear about gene silencing, and I'm the lucky one out of all the researchers today that got to talk about it. We'd like to change the wording of that. I know a lot of people have heard of gene silencing, but it's more Huntington lowering, because we're trying to lower the Huntington protein, but not necessarily get rid of it completely, because we know it's important. If we get rid of it completely in embryos, they don't survive. So we know it's really important in our cells, so we don't want to get rid of it completely. So going back to this, we have these genes they're really the instructions to make these proteins, and the proteins are the things that do all the work in our cells and really allow us to function. But it's slightly more complicated than that. We have, if you can think of the gene and the genetic code is really important, and you don't want to ruin it. So it's kept inside the nucleus of our cells so it doesn't get damaged. And then what the cells do is they make a copy or a message of the gene. That's what's used by the cell's factory to make the protein. So this is kind of the basic dogma of biology. But this Ionis Pharmaceuticals started a development program for this Antisense Oligonucleotide, which is a bit of a mouthful, but you can just call it ASO. And all it really is a single-stranded DNA molecule, chemically designed or modified. And what it does is it binds. We can design them to specifically bind to whatever message molecule you want. So this Ionis Pharmaceuticals developed this HTTRX ASO that would bind to the Huntington message, and that would cause the message to be destroyed, and then less protein gets made. So that's how it all works, and they've shown in mice that if you give this ASO to the sick Huntington's disease mice, they can get better. So not only did they slow things down, but the mice actually got better as well. So first, kind of some evidence that these things can make a huge difference. And this trial started 3 years ago, and we've been here a few times. Ed's been here, I think, the last time I think he was over, it was just after he gave the first dose of this trial. And a lot has happened in the last 3 years. Just to tell you a bit more about this kind of drug, so it's not the kind of drug that can be taken in the mouth, because it's these DNA molecules are really fragile, and our stomach acids and enzymes would destroy them. So they have to be injected. We know that a lot of the pathology and things that are going wrong in Huntington's disease are happening in the brain and in the central nervous system. So the drug is delivered through what's called intrathecal injection or a lumbar puncture. And that's just like an injection into the bottom of the spine, very similar to an epidural that people will get when women are going through labour and get to receive painkillers. Very similar kind of idea. And this allows the drug to get right up into the brain, into the CSF that bathes the brain. And how the trial was designed, this is a first-in-human study, so quite high-risk study, and a drug getting delivered right into the nervous system. So really, no one knew whether this was going to be disastrous. The people that were in this first phase of the trial were very heroic, and we didn't know what the safety concerns were going to be through this. So how they design studies like that, they start with the small number of people that receive a really low dose, and check whether that's safe, and then until they've proved that that's safe, they'll go on to a slightly higher dose in a few people, and then continue to raise up to, they had eventually 5 doses tested, and there was only about 46 people worldwide that took part in the study, so really small. A quarter of them were on placebo, but really just designed to test for safety. So what's happened since then? A year ago, I presented this last year that Ionis had a press release to say that they were very happy with the safety and tolerability of the drug profile so far in the trial, and they had said they were setting up an open label extension. And I can't really emphasise enough why it was so important that this was safe and tolerable. When Cerebral first announced that they were going to do this kind of trial back in HDANI, I think it was maybe 2012 or something that she announced it, she received a lot of negative. Neurologists across the world were saying, you can't do this, it's so unsafe, and that's to prove that they could do this and that it was safe. Nobody dropped out of this trial, and these are people receiving 4 lumbar puncture injections, and it's hard to think why that's such a big result. But something bigger happened, and I'm sure everyone has heard something on the set of the 11th of December 2017 back this year. And I've never heard Huntington's disease talked about so much in the news. I think it'd be impossible if any of you missed it. And all this was the top line results of this trial. And what was said, one, that Roche, who had been in partnership with Ionis Pharmaceuticals from the start and supplying all the funds for the development, have fully exercised their option to license the drug. So they were happy with the progress so far, and they were going to take over and commit to taking it to the market if all goes well. And again, safety and tolerability profile was very good, and this is the key thing. Dose-dependent reductions of mutant huntingtin were observed in the participants, and this is the graph that really, there was people at conferences getting really emotional when these results were published, and what that's actually showing is this was kind of a concept before you can test this in humans. We could show in mice that you could lower the mutant huntingtin protein, but until you test these, it's a whole new way to treat diseases, this type of antisense oligonucleotide treatment. And this was a proof that we could actually change the level of the mutant huntingtin protein in patients. And we don't know yet if that's going to be beneficial, but that was really exciting to see, and it exceeded the expectations of lowering that they previously had estimated based on their animal models. And what this graph shows is that even at the end of the trial, the levels of the mutant huntingtin protein were still getting lower, and so there's further potential to decrease further if they maybe keep treating people longer. This is from Twitter, tweeting Serge Britzi's talk at one of the neurology conferences in the British Neurology Association. There were some associations with some of the clinical scores, but this trial was not designed to look at efficacy. All of the clinical and additional scores were there for safety, but the fact that there was even a hint of something happening was really exciting. But again, not evidence of clinical efficacy just yet. But what's happening next? So there's been further announcements, which might not be public yet, but we were at the European Huntington's Disease meeting 2 weekends ago, and Roche did a public announcement at that, giving outline of the next plans for the next big trial. One thing to note, so it's no longer Ionis HTTRX, and now the drug is being changed to RG6042, which is not as sexy as HTTRX, but they're pumping in lots of money to try and get this drug through, so we'll give them that. So we're expecting these trial results to be fully published by the end of the year. But the real thing everybody wants to know about is the Big Efficacy Trial. So this is some slides or images that have been HD Buzz tweeted about that I've stolen, but these are directly from the presentation that Scott Schobel did from Roche, and this is basically their timeline. So the open label extension is ongoing, so all the 46 individuals that volunteered for that first trial are now getting the drug, so even the people that were on the low doses or on the placebo are now getting that active drug over a year to try and get more information about different dosing over a longer period of time and at different intervals to see whether if it's once a month that needs it or once every 2 months. And they have also announced that they're going to do what they call a natural history study. And that is going to be 100 people across the world. And that's people are just going to have lumbar punctures to take information from the spinal fluid that we don't have enough, there's not enough studies so far done in HD in health, with just looking at how the disease progresses in these kind of measures that we're measuring in the CSF and the spinal fluid. So it's important to collect all this data before we try and decide whether this big trial is working. This is to get all the tools that we need to, if it is working, we can actually measure it. Because at the minute it might be difficult to know if it's definitely working. And that's kind of the design of that. They'll go through 4 lumbar punctures in that, and those people will get to go into an open label extension afterwards where they'll get the drug. And the new phase 3 trial has been announced to be Generation HD and is loosely connected to a phrase of global evaluation of efficacy and safety of Roche Genotech Antisense Oligonucleotides for Huntington's disease. So I think they're a bit stretching to try and get Generation HD from that. And there's going to be 660 people worldwide recruited into this trial, and I think they mentioned 80 to 90 sites globally. So it's going to be a huge trial. There'll be 3 different dosing groups. It's going to be 1-to-1 placebo to drug. So that means half of the people in this study will not be receiving the drug. And it's important to note when people want to put themselves forward for these trials, you need to know what is involved. And it's great to want and volunteer for these things, but it's a lot of work. These people are going to be in a trial for over 25 months, getting over 24 lumbar punctures, and half of them might not even get the drug. So it's a big commitment, and we commend anybody who volunteers for these things, but don't be desperate to, it will get tested no matter what if you get onto these trials. And I've got a lovely message from Ed to kind of outline what he thinks all these results mean.
Hi everyone, sorry I can't be with you, but Lauren asked me to do a short segment for the middle of her talk, which I'm sure you're enjoying. I thought it might be helpful to talk briefly about what I think the lowering of mutant huntingtin in the Ionis trial actually means for the HD community. And I had a revelation while I was talking to a patient in clinic who is an actor. So we've been talking about films, and he asked me what this trial result means. And it suddenly occurred to me that it is a lot like the movie Predator, where there's a group of people in the jungle fighting an invisible enemy, and everyone that this enemy has come into contact with has died, and it can't be seen and it can't be injured. And then halfway through the film, they see this enemy in the background, and they all fire their guns into the jungle, and they think it's escaped. But then on a leaf, they see this fluorescent green liquid, and they realise that it is the blood of the enemy that's been hunting them. And in a very dramatic moment, Arnie turns to the camera and says, "If it bleeds, we can kill it." And I think that's what this result means for the HD community. We've shown for the first time that the bad guy, the cause of Huntington's disease, can be altered, it can be influenced, we can fight back against this enemy. we've achieved a significant victory. We've reduced the level of that protein by about half. And if that continues to be safe, then we have every reason to expect that that will translate into clinical benefit. When Arnie turns to the camera and says, if it bleeds, we can kill it, he doesn't know for sure that we're going to kill the enemy, although, spoiler alert, they do. What he's saying is that for the first time, we have evidence that human beings can make a difference and can fight back and achieve a meaningful result. So I think that's where we are right now with this drug and with this program. And the next trial has now been announced. It's going to be a huge trial. It's going to be a lot of work for the people involved. And the vast majority of people affected by Huntington's disease in the world won't be able to take part in that trial. But the trial is going to happen and the drug is going to get tested. And at the end of that trial, or maybe even before the end of that trial, we'll know one way or another whether this drug and this particular administration technique is going to be the first effective treatment for Huntington's disease. If it's not, we can go back to this result where we achieved this victory. If something goes wrong, maybe there's a safety concern or for some reason the drug doesn't slow progression, we can go back to this victory, the lowering of mutant huntingtin, and figure out a different way to turn that into clinical improvement. And there's lots of other huntingtin lowering methods that are all being worked on as well. So, all our eggs are not in one basket. This is a huge victory, and this program is super exciting. But we also have lots of things that are following almost immediately on the heels of this trial result. So I'm super optimistic. It's going to be hard work for everyone, but I'm super optimistic that we'll see some good news from this program or from some other program similar to it in the near future. Back to Lauren. See you soon.
And I happened to find this YouTube video, which I hope you enjoy.
It's using the trees, watching and waiting, killing us off one by one. The chopper is close, but this thing is too fast. We won't make it, it's pointless to run. Talk, no more games.
I don't know what it was. The jungle came alive.
Go on.
It happened very fast. Not easy to describe, but you must have wounded it, unless my eyes deceive. When the big man was killed, its blood was on the leaves.
If it bleeds, we can kill it. She discovered the key. There is proof we can wound it. So repeat after me. If it bleeds, we can kill it.
If it bleeds, we can kill it.
Here now, take a stand.
Here now, take a stand.
We can bring down this beast.
We can bring down this beast.
If we stick to the plan. If it bleeds, we can kill it.
So that happened. That was just a fantastic coincidence that we found that after someone else was obviously thought that was a fabulous connection to HDA as well. So that can be our new theme tune, I think, for the next year. So yeah, we could get if we can get Arne to back us on. Anyway, so what other targets or options are there if this doesn't work that Ed was mentioning? So one thing to note about the current therapy, so a thing about genetics, you get two copies of every gene from one from each parent, and when you get the Huntington gene from one parent, you'll get one bad copy and one good copy. This current drug, this ASO by Ionis, is not targeting either the good or bad copy. It targets both, and it'll lower both types of that. And we don't know yet if that will be bad, or there's enough evidence to suggest that it will still be beneficial and shouldn't cause harm, but we don't know if that might be harmful. But there's another company, Wave Life Science, who are developing similar drugs that target just the bad copy and just the mutant huntingtin. But there's also tons of other different drugs that are under development by different companies targeting either the message molecule, but also going right to the DNA itself and trying to change that. So lots of people are working on this, and different drugs are at various stages of development. So lots of things coming up in the future. So the Wave Life Sciences trials are actually ongoing, and they're starting to recruit people for their safety phase. So that's right following up behind the current trial. And we know that we can wait in the next few years. It's likely we're not going to hear anything for another 4 or 5 years conclusive about the current phase, so be prepared to not hear any positive or negative results until then. So what's public enemy number 2? So I realised I meant to put a slide at the start to make this relevant. Anyway, my public enemy number 2 is silence, and we all know there's a huge amount of silence and stigma in the HD community historically. There's definitely movements to change that, but one thing that's held us back is that we keep Huntington's disease secret in families, and no one talks about it, no one talks to each other, and it really holds back the support we can give each other and the care that we can get if we don't ask for it. So that's one thing that I wanted to address, and there's been a lot happening over the last 25 years to kind of move against that. We've got all these networks that have been forming, like the Huntington's Disease Study Group. HDAI is this huge non-profit pharmaceutical company just for Huntington's disease, and they have their hands in nearly all of the research that's going worldwide and forcing researchers to collaborate, and we're really a lot further along the line than we should be for such a rare disease. So a lot of that's down to CHDI. We've got the European Huntington's Disease Network, which again is another network of professionals as well as family members and the associations. We've got things like HD Buzz that was started by Ed and Jeff Carroll, and HCYO, the youth organisation, which are really changing the way young people have to grow up with HD, and changing kind of the attitudes towards HD. It doesn't have to be something that we all shy away from. Again, HD Buzz is an excellent resource if you want to keep up with research, and they try and do an unbiased summaries of the current research, and in a language that's much more easy to understand. I personally go there to keep up to date in research, even though I am a researcher myself. There's been events like the HD Hidden No More where we met the Pope. Brian filmed us there as well. I'm not going to keep on this video because it's embarrassing how long I hog the Pope for. So, but it was an amazing experience, and that was so many people all there to stand up to HD and have the Pope himself actually acknowledge that the Catholic Church have failed the Huntington's disease community, and that we no longer have to be hidden no more. All these other things that have been happening is like this observational research that we do, and what that is when we look at people that have Huntington's and that don't have Huntington's, and that's the kind of research that I'm involved in, and that's what things like Enroll HD, and you've heard about Track HD before. These have happened over the 25 years, and there's things like brain scans and blood tests and thinking tests, and now even lumbar punctures are becoming kind of a fashionable way to do research, and everybody's getting their research selfies. But all of these have been instrumental in developing all the tools that were going to help us kind of decide if these drugs are working and measure if things are changing that are relevant to the disease. And one example that also comes out of observational research is some of the genetics studies, like they talk about genome-wide association studies. So we know this particular example is about the genetic modifiers, and we know Huntington's is caused by the CAG repeat, but we also know that people with same repeat could have varied 20-30 years of difference in their age of motor onset. So there might be other things around other genetic factors and environmental factors outside of the Huntington gene. And one thing that popped out of these studies was these genes that are involved in taking care of our DNA and repairing it and keeping it healthy. So it could be a new avenue for drug therapies and targets for the future. One thing, we know Huntington's disease is caused by is very much associated with this movement disorder, and actually clinical diagnosis is still very focused on that specific movements because it's very difficult to measure those other symptoms like psychiatric and behavioural side of things and cognitive. So motor diagnosis is still kind of what we use in research in the clinic because it's the most definitive part of Huntington's disease, but we obviously want to get away from that, and all the tools that we use in the clinic are all these rating scales done by clinicians that do these little tests and tap-in tests to assess different things of how people are progressing with the disease. But obviously they're very subjective, they're asking questions, and every rater might do it slightly different, so it's a very difficult thing to standardise. And one thing they also look at is your functional capacity, and that's how they stage patients. And they can look at, these are the kind of tests that you would do if you did Enroll HD. This is all part of the Unified Huntington's Disease Rating Scale. But all these kind of tests are only very useful with people that have already had their motor diagnosis or have their clinical diagnosis. We really want, if we do ever get these disease-modifying therapies or therapies that can slow Huntington's disease down, we need tools that can pick up subtle changes way before, 20 years before symptoms ever occur, so we can know when to treat and also know if we are doing a drug in someone who doesn't have symptoms, do we know if it's working? If we can get really subtle and sensitive measures that happen long before the drug or the disease ever takes effect, that's going to be the long term, that's the ultimate aim, is that we stop Huntington's disease from ever happening. And we've developed things like brain scans. We have sensitive measures that can be picked up, subtle changes that obviously don't mean anything to people clinically because they're long before they have our symptoms, but we can detect things in brain scans. And a new thing, one thing that we work in Team Wild is the cerebral spinal fluid, and trying to look at biofluids like blood and the CSF or spinal fluid to look for chemical changes that might be specific to the disease. And we've already had some success with that. Particularly this result was all down to a test that we can measure this mutant huntingtin protein in the CSF. We wouldn't have been able to show that this drug was doing what it was supposed to do without this tool, and that was developed by Ed in a huge collaboration to develop that test. But it was only published 3 months before that trial started. So before that, there was actually no way to prove that the drug was doing what it was supposed to do. So it's always so important to keep learning more and more from you guys. So I know it can also, when people go to do research, they never know what they're doing it for, and it's often hard to tell patients, but everything we learn is cumulative. And one other thing that I've worked on is this neurofilament light protein, or NFL, and anybody that follows Ed, he's probably gone on about it, and that can be measured in both the CSF and blood, and it increases with HD stage. This graph might not mean much to you, but the red and blue lines just show that NFL in both CSF and blood has really good ability to differentiate between people that don't have symptoms and do have symptoms. And what we find is comparing these kind of biofluid changes compared to brain scans and also the motor score, that clinical rating scale, as well as those thinking tests, these biofluid changes seem to change earlier than these. So this is potentially new ways that we could detect subtle changes later on. So what can you do? Anyone who's available to do Enroll HD, do it. This is a global study that is the real resource of how we're recruiting for future trials in Huntington's disease, whether there's going to be trials in the next few years in Ireland. The more people we get involved in these research studies, the more people reaching out for services, the more people stepping forward, then the more we can argue that we need to get the trials, we need to get the drugs and get the infrastructure in place. And I'm trying to talk to people in Belfast to try and get the Enroll HD in Northern Ireland, and eventually HD Clarity, which is the global CSF collection study, to try and learn more about that. Anybody who knows any young people that would like to take part in research, UCL needs you. They need people for a young adult study. So young adult actually is 18 to 40 in this study. And they're trying to look at, as I said before, trying to see the earliest changes that could be detectable, these subtle differences. And people would come over to London for a 2-day visit. The day 2, they'd have a lumbar puncture, so they'd have to be up for that. To try and find these CSF biomarkers. And they need people who have been tested and either have the mutation or don't have it. And they actually really need controls, or even partners of people that are affected. So if you know anybody who would be interested, they really need more healthy controls, especially young people, 18 to 25-year-olds, if you know anybody. This is the lady to get in touch with, but they told me to put a feeler out to see if anybody knows anyone. But it's people long before they have symptoms, and that study is aimed at really trying to hone in on what are the earliest changes. So it's going to be super important if these drugs work. We'll be ready to have the tools to then do the preventative trials. So finishing up, I want to thank all of the HD research heroes, that especially those who volunteered in that first phase 1 trial. That was a huge risk to themselves, and they didn't really do it for their own benefit, but for their families and for the future and the rest of the HD community. So this is where kind of the title of my talk comes from. Is Ed tweeted that public enemy number 1 is mutant huntingtin and number 2 is silence. And I had a witty back hand at that was, if you combine the two, you get silence, mutant huntingtin. Hey. But again, on a serious note, we need everyone to kind of step forward and start asking for more services. There's always something more we can do, and Niall Pinder did a fantastic talk of kind of simple things that everyone can do to kind of take more control of the situation, because I know how helpless they can feel being in Huntington's disease family. But there's more services than you think, and get in touch with the HDAI or anyone that you can that can give you advice, and maybe if you don't know where to go, they might be able to steer you in the right direction. If there's someone saying, oh, if a doctor saying there's nothing we can do, it's Huntington's disease, I really don't think that's always the case. So make sure you're getting sound advice, or steer those doctors to the HDAI or someone to get the right kind of advice. So thank you, and